Welcome to Reading Time, comrades. And today on Leaping Larry's Reading Theater, we are, of course, reading from the collected works of Joseph Stalin, Volume 1. We have been reading this for a little while now. We are down here on page 145 if you're on the PDF version, or 124 if you're following along on a physical copy. You can get the free PDF, of course, at iskrabooks.org. This is the Volume 1 collected works. This is a reply to a social democrat. And of course, we're going to have a couple footnotes here, as communists like to do. Original editor. J.V. Stalin's article, a reply to Social Democrat, which we read for the last part of this, published in number 11 of Proletarius Britola, met with lively response from the Bolshevik center abroad. Briefly summing up the gist of the article, V.I. Lenin wrote in Prolarity, we note in the article, reply to Social Democrat, an excellent presentation of the celebrated question of the introduction of consciousness from without. The author divides this question into 4 independent parts. Number 1. The philosophical question of the relation between consciousness and being. Being determines consciousness. Corresponding to the existence of 2 classes, 2 forms of consciousness are worked out. The bourgeois and the socialist. Socialist consciousness corresponds to the position of the proletariat. 2. Who can and who does work out this socialist consciousness? Scientific socialism, as it's known. Modern socialist consciousness can arise only on the basis of profound scientific knowledge. Kautsky, i.e., it is worked out only by a few social democratic intellectuals who possess the necessary means and leisure. Which is why a lot of us are saying, by the way, comrades, today, if I can just give you a little side note, that's why a lot of us are saying today, one thing we need is professional revolutionaries. People who can dedicate their time to studying and practicing and organizing. It's an important thing. 3. How does this consciousness permeate the minds of the proletariat? It is here that social democracy, and not only social democratic intellectuals, comes in and introduces socialist consciousness into the working class movement. 4. What does social democracy meet with among the proletariat when it goes among them to preach socialism? An instinctive striving towards socialism. Together with the proletariat, there arises of natural necessity a socialist tendency among the proletarians themselves, as well as among those who adopt the proletarian standpoint. This explains the rise of socialist strivings. Again, Kautsky. From this, the Mensheviks draw the following ridiculous conclusion. Quote, hence, it is obvious that socialism is not introduced among the proletariat from without, but on the contrary, emanates from the proletariat and enters the heads of those who adopt the views of the proletariat. See V.I. Lenin Works, 4th Russian edition, Volume 9, page 357. So there we go. That's your footnote for the title. A reply to Social Democrat. First of all, I must apologize to the reader for being late with this reply. It could not be helped. Circumstances obliged me to work in another field, and I was compelled to put off my answer for a time. You yourselves know that I cannot dispose of ourselves as we please. I must also say the following. Many people think that the author of the pamphlet, briefly about the disagreements in the party, which is the thing we read last time, was the Union, committee, and not one individual. I must state that I am the author of that pamphlet. the Union Committee acted only as editor. And now to the point. My opponent accuses me of being, quote, unable to see the subject of the controversy, of obscuring the issue. And he says that the controversy centers around organizational and not programmatic questions. And now here we get a note on this quote, obscuring the issue. Let's see what this note is. See reply to a union reply to a union committee. Page 4. Original editor. I replied to a union committee was published from a supplement to number 3 of the Social Democrat of June 1st, 1905. It was written by N. Jordania, the leader of the Georgian Mensheviks, whose views had been subject to scathing criticism by J.V. Stalin in his pamphlet Briefly about the Disagreements in the Party and in Other Works. Again, if you want to know about that criticism, go back and watch the last reading we did of this, and that we read that right there, Briefly about Disagreements in the Party. So, my opponents accuse me of being unable to see the subject of the controversy, of obscuring the issue. And he says that the controversy centers around organizational and not programmatic questions. Only a little observation is needed to reveal that the author's assertion is false. The fact is that my pamphlet was an answer to the first number of the Social Democrat. The pamphlet had already been sent to the press when the second number of the Social Democrat appeared. What does the author say in the first number? Only that the majority has taken the stand of idealism, and that this stand fundamentally contradicts Marxism. Here, there is not even a hint of organizational questions. What was I to say in reply? Only what I did say, namely, that the stand of the majority is that of genuine Marxism. And if the minority has failed to understand this, it shows that it has itself retreated from genuine Marxism. Seems like there's a lot of purity testing going on here, but hey, what do I know? That is what anybody who understands anything about polemics would have answered. But the author persists in asking, why don't you deal with organizational questions? I do not deal with those questions, my dear philosopher, because you yourself did not say a word about them. One cannot answer questions that have not yet been raised. Clearly, obscuring the issue, hushing up the subject of controversy, quote unquote, and so forth, are the author's inventions. On the other hand, I have grounds for suspecting that the author himself is hushing up certain questions. He says that, quote, the controversy centers around organizational questions. But there are also disagreements between us on tactical questions, which are far more important than disagreements on organizational questions. Our critic, however, does not say a word about these disagreements in his pamphlet. Now this is exactly what is called obscuring the issue. What do I say in my pamphlet? Modern social life is built on capitalist lines. There exist two large classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and between them a life and death struggle is going on. The conditions of life of the bourgeoisie compel it to strengthen the capitalist system, but the conditions of life of the proletariat compel it to undermine the capitalist system, to destroy it. Corresponding to these two classes, two kinds of consciousnesses are worked out, the bourgeois and the socialist. Socialist consciousness corresponds to the position of the proletariat. Hence, the proletariat accepts this consciousness, assimilates it, and fights the capitalist system with redoubled vigor. Needless to say, if there was no capitalism and no class struggle, there would be no socialist consciousness. But the question now is, who works out? Who is able to work out this socialist consciousness, i.e. scientific socialism? Kotze says, and I repeat his idea, that the masses, the proletarians, as long as they remain proletarians, have neither the time nor the opportunity to work out socialist consciousness. Modern socialist consciousness can arise only on the basis of profound scientific knowledge, says Kotze. See Kotze article quoted in What is to be Done, page 27. Highly recommend What is to be Done. The vehicles of science are the intellectuals, including, for example, Marx, Engels, and others, who have both the time and opportunity to put themselves in the van of science and work out socialist consciousness. Clearly, socialist consciousness is worked out by a few social democratic intellectuals who possess the time and the opportunity to do so. Now, keep in mind, times have changed a great deal with our rapid access to information and the rate at which we can spread it. But this is very important to understand the origin still. And this does still allude to why leaders are so important. And not everything can be done on the internet or through social media. And so leaders will still have this key importance, like you see in DPRK and Cuba, Laos, everywhere else, for this reason. But what importance can socialist consciousness have in itself if it is not disseminated among the proletariat? It can remain only an empty phrase. Things will take an altogether different turn when that consciousness is disseminated among the proletariat. The proletariat will become conscious of its position and will more rapidly move towards the socialist way of life. It is here that social democracy, and not only social democratic intellectuals, comes in and introduces socialist consciousness into the working class movement. This is what Kotze has in mind when he says, quote, socialist consciousness is something introduced into the proletariat class struggle from without. And that's from the same work. You can read What is to be Done for that quote. Thus, socialist consciousness is worked out by a few social democratic intellectuals. But this consciousness is introduced into the working class movement by the entire social democracy, which lends the spontaneous proletarian struggle a conscious character. That is what I discuss in my pamphlet. And this, by the way, is why the social democracy of today does not resemble that social democracy that we see Stalin talking about here. Social democracy, like expressed in the DSM, and if if struggling in the DSA is the best place for you, then fine. But just understand that the DSA is not the same as what they were struggling with back in those days. And that it's not, it currently, as it stands right now, the DSA is not an organization that is concerned with raising socialist consciousness necessarily, right? It's not concerned with using Marxism to raise socialist consciousness like what what Lenin and Stalin and Kotze and these people understood. That's what the nature of social democracy, that was the mission of social democracy, right? As we know, in modern terms, in Canada, in the US, doesn't really have that mission anymore. And we'll see as we read on through Stalin's collected works, in fact, even before the socialist revolution wins, you see that social democracy proves itself to be a betrayal of the proletariat. And that will happen when we see the Imperial War pick off. It's still a little ways away. Anyway, to continue. Thus, socialist... Wait, was I here? Yeah. Thus, socialist consciousness is worked out by a few social democratic intellectuals. But this consciousness is introduced into the working class movement by the entire social democracy, which lends the spontaneous proletarian struggle a conscious character. That is what I discuss in my pamphlet. Such is the stand taken by Marxism, and with it, by the majority. What does my opponent advance in opposition to this? Properly speaking, nothing of importance. He devotes himself more to hurling abuse than to elucidating the questions. Evidently, he is very angry. He does not dare to raise questions openly. He gives no straight answer to them, but cravenly evades the issue, hypocritically obscures clearly formulated questions, and at the same time assures everybody, I have explained all the questions at one stroke. Thus, for example, the author does not even raise the question of the elaboration of socialist consciousness, and does not dare to say openly whose side he takes on this question, Kautsky's or the economists'. True, in the first number of the Social Democrat, our critic made rather bold statements. At that time, he openly spoke in the language of the economists. But what can one do? Then he was in one mood, now he is in a different mood. And instead of criticizing, he evades this issue. Perhaps because he realizes that he is wrong, but he does not dare openly to admit his mistake. In general, our author has found himself between two fires. He is at a loss as to which side to take. If he takes the side of the economists, he must break with Kautsky and Marxism, which is not to his advantage. If, however, he breaks with economism and takes Kautsky's side, he must subscribe to what the majority says. But he lacks the courage to do this. And so he remains between two fires. And what could our critic do? He decided that the best thing is to say nothing, and indeed he cravenly evaded the issue that was raised above. What does the author say about introducing consciousness? Here too, he betrays the same facilitation and cowardice. He shuffles the question and declares with great aplomb, Kautsky does not say that, quote, intellectuals introduce socialism into the working class from without. Page 7. Excellent. But neither do we Bolsheviks say that, Mr. Critic. Why do you have to tilt at windmills? How is it you cannot understand that in our opinion, the opinion of the Bolsheviks, socialist consciousness is introduced into the working class movement by social democracy, and not only by social democratic intellectuals? And see, for that quote, see briefly about disagreements of the party. Again, we read that in the last episode. Why do you think that the Social Democratic Party consists exclusively of intellectuals? Do you not know that there are many more advanced workers than intellectuals in the ranks of social democracy? Cannot social democratic workers introduce socialist consciousness into the working class movement? Evidently, the author himself realizes that his proof is unconvincing, and so he passes on to other proof. Our critic continues as follows. Quote, Kautsky writes, together with the proletariat, there arises of natural necessity of socialist tendency among the proletarians themselves, as well as among those who adopt the proletarian standpoint. This explains the rise of socialist strivings. Unquote. Hence, it is obvious, comments our critic, that socialism is not introduced among the proletariat from without, but, on the contrary, emanates from the proletariat and enters the head of those who adopt the views of the proletariat. A reply to Union Committee, page 8. Kautsky does kind of suck, but right now we're taking Kautsky's side, sadly. It happened. It happened for a while. But he was right for a bit, in a sense. In a broken clock kind of way. Thus, writes our critic, and he imagines that he has explained the matter, What do Kautsky's words mean? Only that socialist strivings automatically arise among the proletariat. And that is true, of course. But we are not discussing socialist strivings, but socialist consciousness. What is there in common between the two? Are strivings and consciousness the same thing? Cannot the author distinguish between socialist tendencies and socialist consciousness? And is it not a sign of paucity of ideas when, from what Kautsky says, he deduces that socialism is not introduced from without? What is there in common between the rise of socialist tendencies and introducing of socialist consciousness? Did not the same Kautsky say that, quote, socialist consciousness is something introduced into the proletarian class struggle from without? See What is to be Done, page 27. Evidently, the author realizes that he is in a false position, and in conclusion, he is obliged to add, quote, it does indeed follow from the quotation that Kautsky that socialist consciousness is introduced into the class struggle from without, unquote. A reply to the Union Committee, page 7. Nevertheless, he does not dare openly and boldly admit this scientific truth. Here too, our Menshevik betrays the same facilitation and cowardice in the face of logic as he did before. Such is the ambiguous reply Mr. Critic gives to the two major questions. What can be said about the other minor questions that automatically emerge from these big questions? It would be better if the reader himself compares my pamphlet with our author's pamphlet. But one other question must be dealt with. If we are to believe the author, our opinion is that, quote, the split took place because the Congress did not elect Axelrod, Zuchlich, and Starover as editors. I reply, page 13. And consequently, that we deny the split, conceal how deeply it affects principle, and present the entire opposition as if it were a case of 3 rebellious editors. Same, a reply, page 16. Here, the author is again confusing the issue. As a matter of fact, 2 questions are raised here: the cause of the split, and the form in which the disagreements manifested themselves. The first question I give the following straight answer. Quote, it is now clear on what grounds the disagreements in the party arose. As is evident, 2 trends have appeared in our party: the trend of proletarian firmness and the trend of intellectual wavering. And this intellectual wavering is expressed by the present minority, quote unquote. See briefly, page 46. As you see, here I attribute the disagreements to the existence of an intellectual and a proletarian trend in our party, and not to the conduct of Martov-Axelrod. The conduct of Martov and the others is merely an expression of intellectual wavering. But evidently, our Menshevik failed to understand this passage in my pamphlet. As regards the second question, I did indeed say, and always shall say, that the leaders of the minority shed tears over front seats, and led the struggle within the party precisely such a form. Our author refuses to admit this. It is nevertheless a fact that the leaders of the minority proclaimed a boycott of the party, openly demanded seats on the Central Committee, on the Central Organ, and on the Party Council, and in addition declared, quote, we present these terms as the only ones that will enable the party to avoid a conflict which will threaten its very existence, unquote. See commentary, page 26. What does this mean, if not that the leaders of the minority inscribed on their banner not an ideological struggle, but a struggle for seats? It is common knowledge that nobody prevented them from conducting a struggle around ideas and principles. Did not the Bolsheviks say to them, establish your own organ and defend your views? The party can provide you with such an organ. See commentary. Why did they not agree to this if they were really interested in principles and not in front seats? We call all this political spinelessness of the Mensheviks' leaders. Do not be offended, gentlemen, when we call a spade a spade. Formally, the leaders of the minority did not disagree with Marxism and Lenin on the point that socialist consciousness is introduced to the working class movement from without. See programmatic article in Iskra number 1. But later, they began to waver and launched a struggle against Lenin, burning what they had worshipped the day before. I called that swinging from one side to another. But do not be offended at this either, Messieurs Mensheviks. Stalin getting fucking spicy. Yesterday, you worshipped at the centers and hurled thunderbolts at us. Because, as you said, we expressed lack of confidence in the Central Committee. But today, you are undermining it, not only at the centers, but at centralism. See the first all-Russian conference. I call this lack of principle. And I hope you will not be angry with me for this either, Messieurs Mensheviks. If we combine such features as political spinelessness, fighting for seats, facilitation, lack of principles, and others of the same kind, we shall get a certain general feature known as intellectual wavering. And it is primarily intellectuals who suffer from this. Clearly, intellectual wavering is the ground, the basis on which fighting for seats, lack of principle, and so forth arise. The facilitation of these intellectuals, however, springs from their social position. That is how we explain the party split. Do you understand at last, dear author, what difference there is between the cause of the split and the forms it assumes? I have my doubts. Such is the absurd and ambiguous stand taken by the Social Democrat and its queer critic. On the other hand, this critic displays great daring in another field. In his pamphlet of 8 pages, he manages to tell 8 lies about the Bolsheviks. And such lies that they make you laugh. You do not believe it? Here are the facts. First lie. In the author's opinion, quote, Lenin wants to restrict the party and convert it into a narrow organization of professionals. Unquote. But Lenin says, quote, it should not be thought that party organizations must consist solely of professional revolutionaries. We need the most diversified organizations of every type, rank, and shade, from extremely narrow and secret organizations to very broad and free ones. Unquote. Minutes, page 240. Second lie. According to the author, Lenin wants to, quote, bring into the party only committee members. Page 2. But Lenin says, quote, all groups, circles, subcommittees, etc. must enjoy the status of committee institutions or of branches of committees. Some of them will openly express a wish to join the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and provided that this is endorsed by the committee, will join it. See A Letter to a Comrade, page 17. See V.I. Lenin Works, 4th Russian edition, volume 6, where you can see it now. And as you see, in Lenin's opinion, organizations may be accepted into the party, not only by the Central Committee, but also by local committees. Third lie. In the author's opinion, quote, Lenin is demanding the establishment of the domination of intellectuals in the party, page 5. But Lenin says, quote, the committees should contain, as far as possible, all the principal leaders of the working class movement from among the workers themselves. See A Letter to a Comrade, page 7 and 8. I.e., the voices of the advanced workers must predominate not only in all other organizations, but also in the committees. Fourth lie. The author says that the passage quoted on page 12 of my pamphlet, "The working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism, etc., is entirely a fabrication." Page 6. As a matter of fact, I simply took and translated this passage from What is to be Done. This is what we read in that book on page 29. Quote, "The working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism, but the more widespread and continuously revived in the most diverse forms. Bourgeois ideology nevertheless spontaneously imposes itself upon the working class still more." Unquote. This is the passage that is translated on page 12 of my pamphlet. This is what our critic called a fabrication. Do not know whether to ascribe this to the author's absent-mindedness or chicanery. Fifth lie. In the author's opinion, quote, "Lenin does not say where the workers strive towards socialism of natural necessity." Page 7. But Lenin says that, quote, "the working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism." And what is to be done? Page 29. Open your fucking eyes, Stalin says. I love Stalin's writing so much. Sixth lie. The author ascribes to me the idea that socialism is introduced into the working class from without by the intelligentsia. Page 7. Whereas I say that social democracy, and not only social democratic intellectuals, introduces socialist consciousness into the movement. Again, use your eyeballs. Seventh lie. The author's opinion. Lenin says that socialist ideology arose, quote, "quite independently of the working class movement." Unquote. Page 9. But such an idea certainly never entered Lenin's head. He says that socialist ideology arose, quote, "quite independently of the spontaneous growth of the working class movement." What is to be done? Page 21. Eighth lie. The author says that my statement, "Plekhanov is quitting the minority," is tittle-tattle, unquote, is a matter of fact. What I had said has been confirmed. Plekhanov has already quit the minority. See ya! And yet the author has the audacity to accuse us in number 5 of the Social Democrat of having distorted the facts concerning the Third Congress. Come on! I shall not deal with petty lies with which the author has so plentifully spiced his pamphlet. It must be admitted, however, but the author did say one thing that was true. He tells us, quote, "when any organization begins to engage in tittle-tattle, its days are numbered." Page 15. This is the downright truth, of course. The only question is, who is engaging in tittle-tattle? The Social Democrat and its queer knight, or the Union Committee? We leave it to the reader to decide. One more question, and we have finished. The author says, with an air of great importance, quote, "The Union Committee reproaches us for repeating Plekhanov's ideas. We regard it as a virtue to repeat the ideas of Plekhanov, Kautsky, and other equally well-known Marxists." Unquote, page 15. So, you regard it as a virtue to repeat the ideas of Plekhanov and Kautsky. Splendid, gentlemen. Well then, listen. Kautsky says that, quote, "socialist consciousness is something introduced into the proletariat class struggle from without, and not something that arose out of it spontaneously." Unquote. See passage quoted from Kautsky in What is to be Done, page 27. The same Kautsky says that, quote, "the task of social democracy is to imbue the proletariat with the consciousness of its position and the consciousness of its task." Unquote. Same thing, page 27, What is to be Done. We hope that you, Mr. Mensheviks, will repeat these words of Kautsky's and dispel our doubts. Let us pass to Plekhanov. Plekhanov says, quote, Nor do I understand why it is thought that Lenin's draft, Plekhanov is discussing Lenin and Martov's formulation of one S1, the rules of the party. That fucking character that I don't know how to make a noise for. If adopted, would close the doors of our party to numerous workers. Workers who wish to join the party will not be afraid to join an organization. They are not afraid of discipline, but many intellectuals, thoroughly imbued with bourgeois individualism, will be afraid to join. Now that is exactly the good side about it. These bourgeois individualists are, usually, also representatives of opportunism of every sort. We must keep them at a distance. Lenin's draft may serve as a barrier against their invasion of the party, and for that reason alone, all opponents of opportunism should vote for it. See minutes, page 246. We hope that you, Mr. Critic, will throw off your mask and with proletarian straightforwardness repeat these words of Plekhanov's. If you fail to do this, it will show that your statements in the press are thoughtless and irresponsible. Proletariat Britzola, The Proletarian Struggle, number 11, August 15th, 1905, unsigned, but we know it's from our boy Stalin, translated from Georgian. There you go. That is our work today.